The year was 1883, and though the echoes of war had long since vanished into dust in the southern edges of Colorado, silence still lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. Just beyond the reach of Dry Creek, where the land cracked with drought and the fences leaned like old men against the wind, stood a place the maps barely named High Hollow Ranch. It wasn't grand, not by anyone's measure. The wood had grayed under decades of wind and sun. The porch creaked with every shift of weight, and the windows had long since forgotten what laughter sounded like. Some places spoke loud with their ghosts. High Hollow whispered. It was the kind of place where even the birds didn't sing. That morning, before the sun had fully peeled the frost from the earth, a wagon rolled slow up the narrow path. It didn't rattle with urgency. It moved like it was careful not to stir up whatever memories still haunted the soil. On the back sat a woman, quiet, upright, and watchful. Her boots were scuffed from too many miles, and tied around her neck was a single ribbon, faded but tied with care. Her name was Nora Whitlow. She was not a woman of frills or fuss. There was something about her steady, sure, like someone who knew exactly what it took to keep walking after the world had buckled beneath her feet, and she carried no apology for it. Some women arrive with stories on their tongues. Nora arrived with hers, packed in silence, where no one could steal or twist them again. On the porch stood Elias Thatcher, a man whose name had once meant something but now lived more in rumor than remembrance. Folks said he was the last of his family, that he hadn't stepped inside a church since the day his wife was buried, that he still talked to the ground like it might answer. He wore grief not as something to heal from, but as something that had become part of his skin, sun-worn and sint. Their eyes met only once. "You the one from the notice?" he asked, voice low like gravel under boots. "If the job's still open," she replied, not blinking. He gave a short nod. "Kitchen's around back. You'll find a bed near the side room. Water's by the pump. Things stay quiet here." Nora met his words like she met everything else in stride. "Quiet suits me." That was it. No handshake, no smile, just two souls standing on either side of a door neither of them had dared to open in years. As she passed him, her skirt brushed the edge of his coat, barely a whisper of fabric, but enough. Elias didn't know it then, but the silence inside that house was already beginning to shift. The next morning, before the rooster had even cleared its throat, Nora was up. She stoked the stove with practiced hands, filled the cabin with the smell of rising bread and bitter coffee. She didn't call out or wait for thanks. She simply moved through the kitchen like someone who needed it to feel like something more than walls and ash. Elias walked through, once paused by the hearth, gave a single nod. Then he walked back out without a word. Some days he rode out before first light, not returning until the stars blinked into the sky. Other days he just sat on the porch, boots still caked in trail dust, staring at nothing. But Nora didn't mind. Silence, after all, was a language she knew well. And if Elias never said a word, that was fine by her. She was fluent in what was left unsaid. By the second week, it became clear Nora didn't just tend a kitchen, she tended the silence. Not with noise or chatter, but with the kind of care that reshaped stillness into comfort. She polished the windows until they caught the light like glass should. She scrubbed floorboards that hadn't seen soapy water in seasons, and she unstuck a stubborn drawer in the pantry that Elias had long since accepted as useless. She never mentioned these small victories. She simply did them, and that was that. Elias noticed. He didn't speak on it, not at first, but he lingered longer in the kitchen when she was there. Some mornings he would stand in the doorway, arms folded, leaning on the frame like he didn't mean to be there but stayed anyway. He'd nod once, maybe twice, then vanish out the back. But the nod mattered. That small motion carried more weight than a speech from most men. It wasn't just her hands that worked wonders. It was her presence, the kind that steadied a space without needing to fill it. Dusty the old hound was the first to give his approval. One morning, while Nora kneaded bread near the open window, she hummed not loudly, just soft and slow. The kind of tune passed down from a mother who stirred soup even while coughing blood. Dusty, who had paid her no mind for days, rose from the porch, padded over, and laid himself right beside her boots. She looked down, surprised. "Well," she whispered, "I guess you're staying too." Elias saw it from the porch. The dog, the humming, the sunlight catching in her hair like it had something to say. He didn't speak, just narrowed his eyes, jaw tight, like something had shifted, and he wasn't sure whether it should be trusted. The change didn't come like thunder. It came the way dawn does, unnoticed until it's already there. One morning, she found a bundle wrapped in paper left on the bench just outside the kitchen door, not marked, not explained. She opened it slow. Inside was a pair of boots, soft leather but clearly made for work, not dainty but solid, reliable. She sat down right there on the step, boots in her lap, and stared at them a long while. That night, over a pot of rabbit stew and black coffee, she spoke not loud, just enough to reach him across the table. "Those boots," she said. "You don't strike me as a man who does things without meaning." Elias looked at his cup, then back at her, saw them in town, thought they looked like they could carry a woman who doesn't stop moving. Nora turned the spoon in her hand, then nodded. "They're finer than any pair I've worked in." "They weren't meant for work," he said. She didn't say thank you, didn't have to. She wore them the next morning. From that day forward, the rhythm of the house changed, not by much, but enough. The tea kettle whistled earlier. The fire was always lit before the chill could settle in. Elias found himself standing just outside the kitchen door longer, listening for her humming. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. A few nights later, when she was folding linens by lamplight, Elias walked past with something soul in his hand. He paused, cleared his throat, and set it down near her elbow, before walking out without a word. Nora unwrapped the bundle slowly. Inside was a brooch shaped like a columbine flower, delicate silver and unexpected. She turned it in her fingers like it might vanish if she blinked. The petals were carved with surprising detail. No card, no explanation, just beauty left quietly. She didn't ask why. She pinned it to her dress collar the next day like it had always belonged there. Later that week, another small offering arrived, not in the form of a gift, but a memory. Elias handed her a folded piece of crinkled paper. She unfolded it to find a childlike drawing done in crayon, two stick figures in front of a lopsided house with bright flowers out front and smoke curling from the chimney. "My wife drew it," he said, not looking at her. "Right after we found out we were expecting." He hesitated, swallowed hard. "After she died, I shoved it in a drawer. Couldn't look at it without feeling the bottom drop out." Nora smoothed the paper gently with her thumb, gaze soft. "It's still growing," she said. "You just planted it different." Elias looked at her, then really looked. And maybe for the first time, he didn't see just the woman who cooked his meals or swept his floors. He saw someone who had walked through fire same as him and chose to build, not burn. That night, as the wind shifted over the prairie and the windows rattled gently in their frames, Elias sat by the hearth longer than usual. Nora hummed while she worked on her mending. No words passed between them, but in that silence something had settled. Something that sounded a little like peace. It was a Tuesday morning when the past came calling. Elias returned from town with dust on his boots and a furrow in his brow. A folded letter clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't speak right away, just set it on the kitchen table with a heaviness that said it didn't belong there. Nora paused with the bread knife still in her hand, looked at the envelope, then up at him. "From someone you know?" she asked. He nodded slow. "Gideon Rourke, my brother-in-law. His voice was stiff, like the name itself left a sour taste in his mouth. Claims he's owed a piece of this land. Says Ruth, my wife, left it to him. Nora wiped her hands and sat unfolding the letter with care. The paper was too clean, the seal just off the ink barely settled into the fibers. She read every word, Tweeth's eyes narrowing. This date. It's 2 weeks after she passed. Elias leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. I never saw this before today. Never heard from him after the funeral. And now, out of the blue, this. Nora tapped the corner of the letter. Seal's wrong. Ink's too fresh. And this handwriting doesn't match anything she signed, assuming you have something. He nodded, stepped out a moment, and came back with a small tin box. Inside were marriage papers, a Bible, and the last note Ruth ever wrote, a simple request to keep the ranch breathing after she was gone. Nora compared the signature quietly, carefully. Then she shook her head. It's forged. Elias exhaled like something hard had been holding his lungs hostage. You sure as rain follows thunder, she said. I worked for a lawyer once back in Kansas, spent a year sorting deeds and birth records while he drank half the town's whiskey. They rode into Dry Creek the next morning. The sky was flat and dull, like even the weather knew something was off. Nora sat beside Elias on the wagon seat, quiet but alert. When they reached the office of Thomas Creed, Dry Creek's lone lawyer and most stubborn man alive, Elias handed him the letter. Creed squinted at the seal, rubbed the ink with his thumb, then grunted like he'd just bitten into something sour. This is bad forgery, he muttered. Amateur stuff. Seal don't match any official registry, and I've seen Ruth's will, filed it myself when she passed. No mention of Gideon Rourke. He's reaching. Elias gave a single nod, then turned to Nora. She caught it first. Creed looked at her with new interest. Smart, he said. You best keep her around. Elias didn't answer, but something in his eyes agreed. A week passed. The fields turned dry again, wind kicking dust against the windows. Then one late afternoon, 3 riders appeared at the edge of the property. Elias saw them before they even crossed the fence line, Gideon at the front with 2 men riding quiet behind him, faces hidden beneath wide hats and too much leather. Elias didn't wait. He stepped out onto the porch, shotgun leaning against the wall but untouched. Nora followed, standing beside him, arms steady at her sides. She didn't wear fear, she wore resolve. Gideon dismounted, swagger heavy in his boots. His smile was wrong, too wide, too clean. Still clinging to your little patch of dust, Elias, he called. Funny how grief makes men sloppy with paperwork. Elias said nothing. Nora, however, stepped forward. You're a little late for condolences, Mr. Rourke. Gideon's eyes flicked to her, appraising. Didn't know the help had a voice in land disputes. She tilted her head, chin high. Neither did the land until someone finally listened to it. That made Gideon bristle, but before he could speak, hoofbeats rose behind him. Thomas Creed rode up fast, stopping short beside the porch. Papers flapped in his satchel as he dismounted. Afternoon, he said. Brought company, court seal and all. He pulled a document from the bag and held it high. This forgery's been reviewed and rejected by the circuit judge. No standing, no rights, no legal claim. Gideon blinked. That fast Creed smiled sharp. Judge didn't need long. Seal's wrong, ink's new, and Ruth's signature wasn't that sloppy when she had a fever, let alone from the grave. Gideon glanced between the lawyer, Elias, and Nora. The 2 men behind him shifted in their saddles, already half turned to leave. Creed added, voice low but firm. You stay 1 more minute and I file for attempted fraud, maybe even trespass with intent. Sound worth it to you? There was a long silence. Dusty barked once from inside the house, sharp and sudden. Gideon exhaled, bitter and beaten. He mounted up without another word, shot a final glance at Nora, this one colder, and turned his horse toward the road. When the sound of hooves faded into the prairie wind, Elias finally spoke. "You saved this place," he said, his voice rough. Nora didn't smile. She simply turned to him, took his hand, and replied, "No, we did." The light was soft on the porch now, the kind of gold that only came after something hard had passed through. And though the ranch looked the same, the crooked porch rail, the dusty windows, the wind-worn path, something had changed. It belonged to them now. Not by blood, not by law, but by standing firm shoulder to shoulder when the storm came looking for weakness and found none. After Gideon Rourke and his lies disappeared into the horizon, the ranch exhaled, not loudly, not all at once, but like a house remembering how to breathe again. There were no fireworks, no celebrations, just a stillness that no longer felt hollow and a woman who kept tending to it like she was coaxing life from forgotten wood. The days settled into a rhythm that felt less like survival and more like choosing to stay. Nora still rose before the rooster did, still brewed coffee as black as coals, still laid out warm bread on the windowsill to cool. But something had shifted in the way she moved through the house. It wasn't about doing anymore, it was about being. She belonged there, and everything she touched, the curtains, the pantry shelves, the copper kettle, knew it too. Outside, she turned her attention to the ground. What had once been bare earth behind the house was slowly transformed. She laid down a small garden, neat rows of carrots, onions, potatoes, even a vine or two if the soil would hold them. But tucked among the vegetables were other things too, things not planted for eating but for reminding. Columbines, red and white and blue, little bursts of color against the dust. She didn't ask permission, didn't make an announcement. She just pressed seeds into dirt and let the land decide what it was ready to carry. One morning, Elias came out to find her on her knees by the edge of the garden, palms stained with soil, hair tucked behind her ears, humming low. He watched from the barn for a long moment, then without a word turned back inside. That evening, as the sun melted down behind the hills, she found something new, a bench. Just there, waiting at the edge of the garden, made from juniper wood, smooth-sanded, unpainted and strong. No plaque, no initials, just a place to sit where things were learning to grow again. She ran her hand along the grain, then sat. The sun warmed her shoulders, the scent of mint and earth curling up around her. When Elias joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 chipped mugs of tea, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Later that week, she found something else, this time not outside, but on her pillow. A book wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. Inside, a collection of poems, the kind printed on thick, creamy paper that still smelled faintly of ink. Between the pages was a ribbon, her ribbon, the one she thought she'd lost. He'd found it, kept it. That night, as she read by the fire, Elias passed through the hallway, slowed his step, and asked in that gruff, gravel-warmed voice of his, "Any of it good?" She looked up, eyes dancing just a little. Some of it reads like the writer got lost halfway through. He chuckled, rubbed the back of his neck. Then it's honest. Evenings became something different after that. Not quiet because of absence, but quiet because of comfort. She mended shirts by the hearth. He read aloud in starts and stumbles, pausing at words he didn't care for. Sometimes they argued about a line. Sometimes they didn't say anything at all. Once, when a metaphor stumped him, he muttered, "What the hell's that even supposed to mean?" Nora answered without looking up. "Means you're supposed to feel it more than understand it." He grumbled. "Sounds like a trap. Sometimes it is." She smiled. That's what makes it worth reading. But perhaps the most surprising shift came not at the ranch, but in Elias himself. One Sunday morning, as the sun peeled back the early frost and the chimney sent up the first ribbon of smoke, Elias walked into the kitchen wearing a clean shirt and a restlessness in his hands. He stood there for a long moment, thumbing the brim of his hat. "There's a church picnic today," he said at last. Nora turned from the stove, wiping her palms on her apron. "You haven't set foot in town in years." "Maybe that's the reason I should." She paused, reading the weight beneath his words. Then she nodded once. "All right, let's go." She dressed in her best, still the patched blue dress she always wore for Sundays, but now pressed the collar pinned with the columbine brooch he'd once left without a note. She tied her hair back with the same ribbon that had survived the journey from nowhere to here. He hitched the wagon, and they rode into Dry Creek side by side like it wasn't something remarkable. But it was. The town noticed. They noticed everything. Elias Thatcher silent. Elias had come down from High Hollow with a woman seated at his side. Not a visitor, not a stranger, but someone who looked like she belonged. Whispers rustled like dry leaves behind picket fences. "Is that him?" Thought he was living like a ghost, that the woman folks been talking about. Elias didn't shrink from it. He tipped his hat when someone greeted him. He even laughed, a real chest-deep laugh, when old Harvey Boone made a joke about the preacher's biscuits. Nora walked beside him with quiet grace, not proud, not timid, just present. She greeted those who offered kind words, accepted pie from women who had once looked past her, and bent low when a small girl with sun-kissed cheeks handed her a fistful of columbines. "Mama said these are for pretty people," the girl whispered. "I think you're the prettiest." Nora took the flowers as if they were made of glass. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll keep them by the window." Elias saw all of it. The way the town shifted. The way she held herself like she'd earned her place, not because she fought for it, but because she simply stayed. And as the hush rolled through the picnic grounds, he raised his voice, not loud but clear. "This is Nora Whitlow," he said. "She keeps my house and kept me from going cold." After that, the whispers didn't matter. People passed plates, smiled, nodded. A few even made room on the bench beneath the shade tree. That night, back at the ranch, Nora placed the columbines in an old pitcher on the windowsill. And for the first time in years, the house didn't just feel inhabited. It felt claimed. The summer bled slow into September. The days still burned, but the nights cooled just enough to remind the trees to think about turning. At High Hollow Ranch, the evenings had a softness to them now, the kind that clung to porch rails and lingered in the folds of old quilts. Nora still kept her routines, folding linens at dusk, tending the last of the columbines before frost claimed them. But now there was a rhythm between her steps and Elias's. It wasn't choreographed. It just fit. Then came the day he didn't return. He'd left before breakfast, said he had to make a supply run to Barlow's Post about 10 miles east. Nothing urgent, just feed bolts for the barn door, maybe some fresh beans if the shipment had come in. Back by supper, he said as he cinched the saddle. But supper came, and the sun sagged low behind the ridgeline. The horizon turned violet, still no sign of him. Nora set 2 places at the table anyway, brewed tea, lit the lantern. She tried not to fidget, but Dusty knew something was off. The old dog paced the door like it could summon him. By the time stars pulled themselves out of the dark, worry had set in. Not panic, but the slow-burning kind that presses between the ribs. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch, listening. Somewhere beyond the hills, an owl called. Then, footsteps, staggered, slow. And there he was, Elias Thatcher, limping up the trail, shirt torn at the side, one arm clutched tight to his ribs, blood dried in a smear down his side. Nora didn't think. She just ran barefoot over gravel skirts hiked to her knees. "Elias!" she cried, voice cracking. He stopped short, bracing himself against the hitching post. Horse spooked, he managed between clenched teeth. Wagon hit a ditch, rolled. You walked back, she asked, already sliding beneath his arm to steady him. He nodded, grimaced. Didn't seem worth waiting. Figured if I didn't start walking, I might not find you here when I got back. That made her stop cold. Not the blood, not the limp. The words. She helped him into the house, eased him into the chair by the fire. Her hands worked fast, cutting fabric, cleaning the wound, wrapping bandages snug around cracked ribs. All the while he watched her, not because he was afraid, but like he couldn't quite believe she was real. When it was done, she sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "Why would I be gone?" she asked quietly. Elias didn't meet her eyes. "Good things don't usually stay," he said, almost to himself. For a long time there was only the hiss of the fire and the faint clink of Dusty's collar as he settled at their feet. Then Nora reached across and took his hand. Not dramatically, not possessively, just surely. "I'm not going anywhere, Elias. Not unless you ask me to." He didn't say anything, but his fingers curled around hers. Calloused, careful, steady. The next few days passed in a hush. Elias healed slow, with every breath a reminder that ribs don't forgive easily. Nora was there reading aloud from the poetry book he'd given her, dabbing sweat from his brow when fevers rose, sitting by the bed even when he drifted into sleep. She never made a show of it, never asked for anything in return. That was what unsettled Elias most, not her care but her calm. Like she wasn't waiting for him to earn it. Like she'd already decided he was worth staying for. And maybe he had too. One golden afternoon, just as the sun slipped between the clouds and painted the fields in amber, Nora stepped outside and sat on the bench by the garden. The columbines were in full bloom, white-yellow, a few daring ones in dusky blue. She rested her hands on her lap, watching them sway like little prayers stitched into the earth. She didn't hear him at first. Elias had moved quieter these days, not from habit but from reverence. He stepped onto the porch and stood there a moment, breathing in the moment like a man tasting peace for the first time. Then he walked to her side. They didn't speak right away, just sat, watched the wind weave through what they had built. Finally, Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of folded paper creased at the edges like it had been opened and closed 100 times. He handed it to her, gaze fixed ahead. Nora opened it gently. The handwriting was uneven. Not sloppy, just vulnerable. The way a man writes when he's not used to asking for things. "There's no need to ask you to stay anymore. You already have. But if you'd let me, I'd like to make it proper. Name and all." Nora read it once, then again. And then slowly she looked at him. Elias didn't reach for her. He didn't pressure. He simply met her gaze, and for the first time since they met, let himself be fully seen. And Nora, who had been overlooked, underpaid, cast off more times than she could count, felt something anchor inside her. He reached up, cupped her face with hands that had spent most of their life building fences and burying pain. His thumb brushed her cheek. Then he kissed her, not like a man claiming territory, but like a man who finally understood what it meant to come home. They married the next Sunday under the cottonwood behind the house, just the two of them, Reverend Monroe and Dusty asleep in the grass. Nora wore her patched blue dress, the columbine brooch pinned at her collar, the same ribbon in her hair. No flowers, no lace, just truth. Afterward, they sat inside and shared tea by the fire like 100 nights before. Only now there was a new name carved into the bench outside, and a place set for a life not stumbled into, but chosen. The weeks that followed their quiet wedding passed not with fanfare but with steadiness. Autumn drifted in across the prairie like a slow-moving hymn-gold light in the mornings. Frost edging the grass, smoke curling from the chimney in soft ribbons. Life at High Hollow Ranch didn't change overnight. The walls didn't suddenly forget the years they'd held sorrow. But something in the air had shifted, like even the wood had finally decided it could trust them. Nora and Elias fell into their days the way tired hearts fall into safe hands. There was laundry on the line again, bread on the windowsill. The porch steps no longer groaned beneath uncertainty but welcomed the weight of lives being lived. The bench Elias built, once just a gesture, became a daily stop. Nora would sit there in the early light, steam rising from her mug, watching the last columbines hold on as the cold crept in. Elias often joined her, their words few but full. Sometimes he'd bring a book, sometimes just himself. That was enough. Inside the house had taken on a new sound, not noise, not chatter, but the warm rhythm of belonging. The fire snapped in the hearth. The kettle sang when it boiled. Dusty thumped his tail in his sleep. And now and then laughter, not the loud public kind, but the shared unspoken kind that lives between two people who have come to understand each other in suits. There were still hard days. Ranch work didn't soften for love. There were fences to mend, roofs to patch, a storm or two that beat against the walls with old fury. But now, when trouble came, it found them side by side, not rescued, not indebted, just together. One early winter morning, Nora took a needle and thread to the hem of her wedding dress, not to fix it, but to reinforce it. She'd decided to wear it again for Christmas supper with a new apron tied around the waist. When she asked Elias if he minded, he looked up from the fire and said, "It's yours, just like this place is now." She didn't reply with words, just leaned in, kissed his forehead and whispered, "Then let's keep making it ours." By then, the townsfolk had long stopped whispering about them. The woman from nowhere had become Nora Thatcher, and High Hollow, once spoken of with pity or speculation, was now described in quieter tones. Looks like someone finally brought it back to life. Reverend Monroe, passing through with extra firewood one evening, said it best. Some places don't wake up until the right souls move in. One afternoon, Elias carved a second name into the bench outside, not as an act of ceremony, but as a quiet truth. He didn't show Nora right away, just let her find it on her own. When she ran her hand across the lettering Thatcher etched right beside her own, she didn't cry. She just sat down, closed her eyes, and let the wind play with the ends of her ribbon. That night, as the fire settled into embers and the land outside tucked itself in for another hard winter, Elias read aloud from the poetry book again. His voice still stumbled now and then, but she never corrected him. And when he reached the last line of the poem, he looked up at her and said, "I think this one's about us." She nodded. Maybe. Or maybe it's about anyone brave enough to stay, because in the end, that's what it was. Not just a story of love found, but of love chosen, of healing built by hand, of silence turned into sanctuary. High Hollow never did grow loud, but it grew full of warmth, of patience, of a home that didn't ask for perfection, only presence. And when the columbines bloomed again in spring, they did so not on accident, but because someone believed they could. Not all love stories begin with fireworks. Some begin with silence, with a woman arriving on a wagon carrying nothing but a ribbon and a past she won't speak of, with a man who hasn't smiled in years handing her a shovel instead of a promise. And yet, that's where healing begins. In a world that glorifies fast connections, loud declarations, and grand gestures, this story reminds us that the truest transformations often happen in the quiet, in the daily choosing, in the coffee made before dawn, in the repaired drawer no one asked to be fixed, in the moment someone sits beside you, not to rescue you, not to change you, but simply to stay. Nora and Elias didn't fall in love like lightning. They grew into love like roots, slow, steady beneath the surface. They didn't fix each other. They honored what was broken and then built something around it, together. What this story teaches us is simple yet profound. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't saying, "I won't leave you," it's showing up each day like you never even thought about leaving. You don't have to be perfect to be worthy of belonging. You don't need eloquent speeches to be heard. What matters is presence, patience, choosing each other again and again even after the storm. Because in the end, home isn't a place. It's a person who lets you rest your name beside theirs and trusts that what you plant together might just bloom. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to Frontier Reverie for more heartwarming tales of quiet love, redemption, and second chances across the American West. Leave a comment below what moment stayed with you most, and if you believe that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is share this with someone who's planted roots after a long storm. Because stories like this, they're meant to be passed on.